My friends and I often joke about which golden girl we'll be when we get older. But as time marches on, I'm realizing that the day I become Sophia Petrillo will be sooner rather than later. I'm George Grant Birch, a real estate and residential lifestyle consultant in Houston, Texas. Lately, a lot of my business has touched on the issue of aging, and it's made me realize just how much there is to think about as we grow older. My parents built my childhood home in 1965, and it was my mother's dream to live there the rest of her life. She did exactly that, and after 40 years in her castle, she passed quickly after a devastating stroke. Aging in place worked out for her, but I often wonder what would have happened if she had lived longer. She had no real plan for aging in that two-story home that had been built specifically to raise 5 boys. And if she had been disabled or otherwise incapacitated, we would have had a real issue on our hands. As fate would have it, we were spared that difficulty, but I often think of that when I visit estate listings where it's obvious the owner has really struggled to live alone. As the youngest in my family, I watched firsthand as my mother transitioned from childcare to elder care when we grew independent and my grandparents' generation got older. Looking back, I realize how each of my ancestors grew old in different places, and it gives me a unique perspective on the practical aspects of each situation. Aging in place may have been a generational thing, and as the boomer and X generations get older, I'm wondering if they'll be as attached to staying in their home as my parents were. From my own life experience, as well as my experience as a residential consultant, most people don't give much thought to how long they will live, much less where they will be when their final time is through. Thanks to advancements in healthcare, humans are living longer than ever, which is even more reason to think ahead. The right residential situation can provide quality until the very end. In this series of videos, I'm going to explore options and offer some considerations that aren't often thought about. It's a difficult subject, but we all face it someday. None of us are getting younger. I encourage you to subscribe to my channel so you can consider your personal situation and determine if and when a residential change may be right for you. In the small town where I grew up in the 60s and 70s, there were essentially 2 options for living out your final years: nursing homes or aging in place. My maternal grandfather was a tall, strong man who worked with his hands most of his life in auto shops and airplane hangars. In addition to being a heavy smoker like most of his generation, his exposure to paints, solvents, dust, and all sorts of harmful materials led him to a debilitating case of emphysema. His wife, my grandmother, had mobility issues from advanced rheumatoid arthritis and was unable to take care of him. So the neighborhood nursing homes seemed to be their only option to get him the care that he needed. It was a dismal place, built of cinder block and linoleum, looking almost exactly like the soulless grammar school that I attended in the 60s. It smelled of soiled linens and despair, and it didn't have much in the way of recreation, socialization, or activities. Just room after room of old people lying in their beds waiting to meet their maker. Mama dutifully visited Granddaddy every day before she picked us up from school, and on Saturdays she would pick up my grandmother and take her to visit her husband. I'm not sure how long Granddaddy lived like that, but in retrospect, it was probably a couple of years. He was the first of my elders to pass, and I'm not sure at the time I understood exactly what that meant. One thing was clear, however. Mama made it known, in no uncertain terms, that she was not to be placed in a nursing home if she couldn't take care of herself. I guess it's fortunate we never got there because she didn't offer an alternative. I'm not sure I remember the exact order that the rest of the elders in the family passed, but I do know all of their situations. I believe my paternal grandfather was next. He dropped dead of a heart attack in the doctor's office as he was settling his bill after being given a clean bill of health for an 82-year-old man. After he passed, my paternal grandmother struggled to live alone for a while, and then moved in with my aunt to live the rest of her life. My maternal grandmother, now widowed, lived alone in the home that had been built to accommodate her mobility issues, and when she took ill from stomach cancer, never left the hospital. Of the elders, that left only my great Aunt Nen, whom my mother adored and took care of until the very end. My piano lessons were near Aunt Nen's house, so Mama would drop me off and visit Aunt Nen while I took my lesson. One day, Daddy came to pick me up from my lesson after Mama had dropped me off. Aunt Nen had fallen and laid on the floor all weekend, unable to reach the telephone. At 80-something years old, her hip had shattered and no amount of physical therapy could get her back on her feet. Because she had the means to pay for it, Aunt Nen hired sitters around the clock to be with her at home so she wouldn't have to go to a nursing home. We put a rented hospital bed in her solarium and she lived 2 to 3 years there before a stroke sent her to the hospital. She never recovered. Mama got a little break from caregiving after Aunt Nen passed, but eventually, time began to take its toll on her generation. Daddy passed at the young age of 68 after a bout with heart disease and then an extended battle with cancer. Because of Mom's good health, he was able to stay home for the duration. As she always wanted, she stayed in her home until the very end, which was partially enabled by the fact that my oldest brother lived nearby and could check on her several times daily. One day on his afternoon visit, she was fine earlier in the morning. He discovered her in her chair, unresponsive, with her knitting still in her hands. The stroke was catastrophic, and during her remaining 48 hours, we weren't sure what to hope for. The doctors told us a full recovery was not in the cards, and if she survived, there would be little quality of life. We would need to plan for her care because she could live for years in a diminished condition. Even though she lived in the town where I grew up, it had been 30 years since I lived there, so I was clueless and panicked. I had no idea what options were available. As consequence would have it, she never stabilized, and we were never faced with having to make those difficult decisions. That gets me to my generation and my late brother Arthur. At the age of 32, he was stricken with esophageal cancer and eventually lost his voice box. That cured the cancer, and he remained cancer-free until shortly after Mama's passing, when it came back with a vengeance. He had great caregivers back home, or so he told us, and everything was under control. He took care of himself at home for a couple of years, until one year, when I was home to visit him for New Year's, I realized there had been a significant decline since I had seen him a week earlier at Christmas. He told me that he had been having a hard time concentrating and sometimes got confused, but he had a doctor's appointment on Monday and would mention it then. We made a few adjustments to make his life a little easier to live on his own, but they were short-lived. After receiving a call from a friend of his that he was concerned for Arthur's well-being, I made some arrangements to have a sitter spend nights with him until I could get there. By the time I got there a few days later, he was really struggling to stay awake, was clearly in pain, and was very confused and obviously scared. I asked him if he wanted me to take him to the emergency room. This was a Friday night, and he was probably right when he said, no, they'll just send us home. Monday morning, I got him to his doctor, who admitted him immediately to the hospital. There are some details here that I'm going to skip, but ultimately, with his team of doctors led by a compassionate pulmonologist, we determined that the best course was to keep him in the hospital-based hospice. Not sure what we would have done if that had not been offered as an option. I'm not sharing these stories to be morose or alarmist, but to underscore the importance of thinking about your family's situation. Today, there are more options available for older adults to live independently or to receive more extensive care in ways my mother never imagined. Open communication, honesty about health conditions, and realistic financial planning can go a long way toward creating comfort for our loved ones and ourselves when the time comes.